Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, today's moment in black history happened in Falls Church, Virginia, 100 years ago this month. From colonial times through Reconstruction, African and European Americans had always lived in close proximity to each other in Falls Church. In the late 19th century, though, with the rise of Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan, Falls Churchers adopted the prevailing belief at the time that African Americans should be segregated from and not allowed to reside near the town's white residents. In 1890, the Falls Church Town Council voted to cede over 1/3 of the town's territory back to Fairfax County because most of the residents were African American. In 1890, the Falls Church Town Council, in 1914, the mayor reported at a town council meeting that he'd been informed that a Negro had rented or was about to rent property at West Falls Church, that the council should adopt a segregation ordinance. The town's first segregation ordinance made it unlawful for any person to sell or rent land or dwellings to members of the Negro race within a certain area. Later that year, the council learned that the state code allowed cities and towns in Virginia to create segregation districts for residents of white and colored persons for the preservation of the public morals, public health, and public order, which were endangered by the residents of white and colored people in close proximity to one another. The statute required that a map be drawn and publicized for 6 months, and that the ordinance would go into effect 1 year from the date of passage. On January 8, 2015, a delegation of African American citizens called the Colored Citizens Protection League, the CCPL, led by Joseph Tinner and Dr. E.B. Henderson, held their first meeting at the home of Joseph Tinner to determine a course of action to protest the segregation ordinance. On January 11, 1915, they attended the town council meeting to provide testimony and letters objecting to the ordinance. In spite of their testimony and over their objections, the ordinance was adopted by a vote of 4-1. The CCPL and Dr. Henderson then met again and contacted the NAACP, which had been formed just 6 years earlier, and asked to become a branch so that they could work together to fight the segregation ordinance. The Ku Klux Klan was very strong in the area at the time. Crosses were known to have been burned on the corner of West Broad and South Washington Street, behind the home of Merton Church, and also on South Maple Avenue on the property of E.B. Henderson. E.B. Henderson, while he worked in D.C., lived on his farm with his family in Falls Church. His grandmother, Louisa, owned and ran a popular store on the 100 block of South Washington Street. Joseph Tinner lived with his family on Tinner Hill. He was a stonemason who received the majority of his livelihood working for people who lived in Falls Church. By protesting this ordinance, the Hendersons and the Tinners, they knew that they were putting their lives and their livelihoods at risk. The situation in Falls Church was so hostile that the NAACP initially declined to provide the CCPL with a branch charter, fearing that it was too dangerous to set up operations in such a rural location. They did agree to provide assistance and legal expertise, though, in their fight against the ordinance. On June 28, 1915, a special meeting was held at the Falls Church Town Council where they agreed to accept boundaries that would have separated the whites from the coloreds in Falls Church, and that 32% of the population of Falls Church that was African American would have been allowed to live on 5% of the town's land. That summer, the CCPL retained an attorney to represent their interests and seek to prevent the ordinance from being enforced. On October 19, 1915, the town council received a letter ruling from the Fairfax County Circuit Court informing them that their ordinance could not be enforced. Meanwhile, lawsuits brought against Richmond and Ashland around the same time to challenge their local ordinances, their local segregation ordinances, were unsuccessful, and the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that the state and local laws regarding segregation ordinances prevailed over the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So while other ordinances in other parts of Virginia prevailed, thanks almost entirely to the work of the CCPL, on the 1-year anniversary of the passage of the 1915 segregation ordinance in Falls Church, the ordinance was not enforced. So that date came and went without the ordinance being enforced. Eventually, in 1917, the Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan versus Worley that no state or municipality in the United States could create segregation districts, that this was in fact unconstitutional. In the spring of 1918, Dr. Henderson once again wrote the New York office of the NAACP to inform them that as a result of the activities of the CCPL, the Falls Church segregation ordinance had never been enforced, and asked again if the CCPL might become an official branch of the NAACP. The national offices agreed that this group of 9, as they were also called, had certainly proven that they could succeed and survive even in a rural area like Falls Church, Virginia. They were granted their charter and became the first rural branch of the NAACP as a result of their successful battle against an unjust ordinance almost exactly 100 years ago this month. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.